Every New York City rail fan knows this map. It is the IND Second System, dated back to 1929. The plan called for dozens of miles of new train lines and extensions, and is probably the most ambitious scheme to expand the New York City subway. But 1929 is also when the Great Depression happened, which massively scaled back the scheme. In the end, only a tiny portion of the map was built, and it was debated how serious those plans were. The New York City subway system was under a financial crisis, and deferred maintenance took a toll on the system. Asking for money from politicians to fix the system was a hard ask, as it was not as glamorous. Like repainting some tiles in some Manhattan station, fixing some signals that no one knows exists, and extending the platforms of stations is boring. But extending the system was, and John Mulaney, the chairman of the Board of Transportation at the time, knew this. So he would create these fantasy maps as bait to raise money for the system, and that money would be used to fix the system instead. But whatever the case, let's say that the IND Second System was a top priority for city and federal officials. They continued with the original 1929 plan, and didn't let the Great Depression nor World War II shrink those plans. After 15 years of construction, which was how long it took to build the first system, the final project of the second system opened in 1944. What will happen? Well, in this video, we will explore the ramifications of what if the IND Second System was actually completed. Let's get the most obvious thing out of the way first. The New York City subway will be much, much larger. This is the current map of the New York City subway, and this will be the map under the IND Second System. Nearly 300 miles of new track would be laid, which is 44% of the current system. And unlike the current system, which is Manhattan-centric, the IND Second System would concentrate in the outer boroughs. Only 45 miles of track would be laid in Manhattan, almost all of it belonging to the 2nd Avenue subway. Though I should not scoff at these numbers, as since the year 2000, the MTA has only managed to add 6.5 miles of new track. But the Bronx would have received 51 miles of new track, and Brooklyn would have received 61 miles of new track. But if you think those levels of investment were ambitious, you have not seen the planned expansions in Queens, as Queens would receive a whopping 136 miles of new track. That is more than the Bronx and Brooklyn put together. Many of the lines that the MTA and railfanners dreamed for decades would finally be completed. For example, the 2nd Avenue subway would have been completed, and with the original Second System plan, which is the one I am going with, is planned to have 6 tracks, with each track planned to have 34 trains per hour. That would have decongested the Lexington Avenue subway several times over. The Utica Avenue subway would be built, ending the southeastern Brooklyn transit desert as we know of today. An extension of the Nostrand Avenue line would also be undertaken to serve the transit desert, and the two lines would have met up in Sheepshead Bay for a massive 4-track elevated station at Voorhees Avenue. The infamous South 4th Street subway would also be built. The subway, proposed to have 6 tracks, would have provisions to be expanded to potentially 10 tracks on 3 different levels. This subway would act as a distributor system to funnel trains from the 6th, 8th, and possibly 2nd Avenue line into either the Utica Avenue line or the Myrtle Central trunk line that ran to the Rockaways. And speaking of the Rockaways, that perfectly segues to Queens. Queens is well known for being a transit desert, as it only has 2.5 subway lines, that half belonging to the Astoria line, as it ends abruptly at Ditmars Boulevard. Well, under this plan, that line would have been extended 10 miles to cross Island Boulevard. For reference, the entire 7 train is 10 miles long, which means the extension of the Astoria line alone rivals the length of the entire 7. But obviously, the Astoria line wouldn't be the only line to be extended. The 7, or the Flushing line, will get 2 new branches to Whitestone, College Point, and Bayside. QBL would get a branch to Southeast Queens, the Van Wyck Boulevard line. Finally, the IND Winfield Spur would cover a huge swath of central and southern Queens, though it was debated on how serious this plan was. On the one hand, there is an entire upper level built, equipped with trackways at Roosevelt Avenue for the IND Winfield Spur. But on the other hand, instead of taking over the LIRR Rockaway Beach branch, which was what planners wanted to do, the Second System called for an entire brand new line that paralleled it. But again, we are assuming that the entire 1929 IND Second System was built, and this line, although not perfect, would have bridged the central Queens transit desert. Finally, the last transit deserts in the Bronx, Throgs Neck and northeastern Bronx, would see great investment. The 2nd Avenue subway would be sent to the Bronx, and have 3 branches. 2 of the branches would have gone to the aforementioned transit deserts, but the 3rd branch would take over the northern portion of the White Plains Road line. Given the fact that the northern portion of White Plains was built under the dual contracts, and how dual contract lines were all built to the same width, platforms would have been shaved back for the extension to go through. However, even with this increase in coverage, it was debatable on how dense the city would have become. Suburbanization was on its way in the 1940s, meaning many people moved out of New York City, and the subways, being expanded, made no difference. For example, the neighborhoods around the IND Fulton subway, which replaced the Fulton L, saw a drop in population as industry and the economy hollowed out in the 50s and 60s. However, what I can say for certain is that Queens, especially Eastern and Central Queens, would be much more like the rest of New York City because of the Second System. Queens was one of the 2 places that saw an increase in population after World War II, as there was an abundance of cheap land. Given the high demand for new housing in Queens, and combined with the new rail lines to facilitate that transport, Queens would have rapidly densified. All in all, the IND would have covered all the 4 boroughs well, stretching from the easternmost tip in Queens, the northernmost tip in the Bronx, and the southern tip of Brooklyn, and funneling them into Manhattan. And yes, I said 4 because in true New York spirit, Staten Island was ignored in this plan. Though there was a quote-unquote vehicular tunnel to Staten Island proposed in the plan. So, yay? But there might be hope, which segues to... After the IND Second System, almost every inch of New York City would be served. Well, that is, except Staten Island. Given attempts to build the Staten Island subway dated back to 1890, a subway to Staten Island would be a top priority. However, what would it look like? Would they use the previous BMT plans and extend the 4th Avenue line? Well, probably not, if we're talking about 1944. Brooklyn's subway planning at the time was either demolish the elevateds or shift as many trains away from DeKalb Junction. That is why we have plans like the IND Culver line, as it would shift BMT Culver L trains away from DeKalb. But even with this branch takeover, there probably isn't enough capacity to serve Staten Island. Anyone waiting for an R train at Bay Ridge Avenue today will tell you that a 12-minute wait is not the way to go. But since the Culver line was 4 tracks underground, but only 3 tracks elevated, this meant that there was excess capacity. So I think the most probable outcome was the IND Fort Hamilton line, with a branch to Staten Island. Once the line got to Staten Island, the line would branch again, with one heading north to St. George, and the other heading south to Tompkinsville. In the future, the Staten Island Railway could have been converted to IND property, as that is where the line was pointed towards. However, after 1945, given how hostile the environment towards public transit was, I think the most likely extension would be to extend the 4th Avenue line into Staten Island, especially after DeKalb Junction was grade separated in 1961. There was more capacity to spare, so who knows? But a priority even higher than the Staten Island subway would simply be another Queens-Manhattan tunnel. If you look closely, you'll see that there was no additional tunnel being proposed. Planners thought the G would do well in soaking local traffic, as Greenpoint and Williamsburg once hosted a ton of industry. However, once QBL opened, the G was next to useless in serving that local traffic. Local commuters piled onto the G, and at the next express station would stream out for a Manhattan-bound express. And it is still the case with not only QBL, but almost every express line out of Manhattan. To remedy this, planners proposed the 79th Street Tunnel in the 1939 version of the IND Second System. But since we are using the 1929 version, there was no 79th Street Tunnel, which is why I think this would be a top priority. Except, where would it link to? Currently, the 63rd Street Tunnel, the current version of the 79th Street Tunnel, is linked to 6th Avenue. But in the 1929 version, 6th Avenue was linked to the 2nd Avenue trunk line, which means our new 79th Street Tunnel won't use this trunk line. But the Broadway Express tracks ended abruptly at 57th Street, 7th Avenue, which meant that the IND will most likely connect the 79th Street Tunnel, or whatever Queens-Manhattan Tunnel, to the Broadway Express tracks. This would do wonders for unification, as it connects the IND Queens Boulevard line with the BMT Broadway line. It won't be on the same level as the Christie Street connection, but will make a sizable difference. Another top priority would be the 2nd Avenue subway extending to Brooklyn. Again, if you look at the 1929 plan, the 2nd Avenue connection to Brooklyn was missing. Because of this, IND Fulton would see some long headways. After all, it has only one subway tunnel to serve 4 branches. No other branch sees this, which is why I can see very quickly that a new tunnel to Brooklyn will be proposed, especially after the 79th Street Tunnel to Queens opens for service. The final priority is the Christie Street connection, and that perfectly segues to... Ever since unification, planners try to find ways to unify the system. I already talked about one such plan, which was to link the IND Queens Boulevard line with the BMT Broadway line, but that pales in comparison to the Christie Street connection. Proposed in 1944, it would have connected the IND 6th Avenue Express tracks to the entirety of the BMT Southern Division, and also connected the IND 6th Avenue local tracks to the BMT Eastern Division. Thanks to this revolutionary idea, the IND was unified with the BMT, as IND trains that used to end in the middle of Manhattan suddenly found their way onto the Manhattan Bridge to Coney Island. However, with the IND Second System, the Christie Street connection, if that were to happen, would look very different. After all, the 6th Avenue Express tracks would have connected to the South 4th Street subway and would be maxed out. However, there was capacity on the 2nd Avenue subway, and according to some sources, the quad-track portion ended at Grand Street, with 2 tracks continuing to Hanover Square. Since Grand Street is on the Christie Street connection, planners would have probably routed BMT Southern Division trains through the 2nd Avenue subway instead. The other part of the equation was the BMT Eastern Division, and whether there will be anything left to connect to. Assuming that the IND South 4th Street subway was to be built, the portion between Essex Street and Broadway Junction of the BMT Jamaica L would probably be demolished. After all, how do you compete with a 6-track underground trunk line? The answer is, you don't. And why stop there? The BMT Nassau Street line would probably also be abandoned thanks to the IND Worth Street line and a nearby 2nd Avenue subway. After all, even without the 2 lines, the Nassau Street line has been downgraded from 4 tracks to 2. So who knows what an additional 2 lines in the vicinity of the Nassau Street line would do. Combined with the fact that this connection will be redundant, as 6th Avenue would connect to the IND South 4th Street subway, there probably will be no connection between the Eastern Division and the IND, just only the Southern Division. But other than the potential Christie Street connection, I don't see any potential for other revolutionary connections. There will be more elevated lines takeovers for sure, like the BMT Culver line, the White Plains Road line, the Liberty Avenue L, and possibly the portion east of Broadway Junction on the Jamaica L. But once you take them over, it will still result in a closed IND system. Back in January, I did a video on how the IND almost always brought new roads, and I'm going to summarize the main points of that video. Basically, the city wanted roads, and the IND created the perfect cover for that. The IND was built cut and cover, and it was pretty disruptive. Therefore, the city used that excuse of being disruptive and built more roads. That was how Queens Boulevard and Houston Street became super wide. The IND Second System would be no different. The South 4th Street subway was a notable example. The street that it would go under, South 4th Street, is way too narrow for a 6-track line. The solution was to turn South 4th Street into a boulevard and destroy buildings to make that happen. Another example would be the Utica Avenue line, as Utica Avenue in certain areas were too narrow for a 4-track trunk line. So, if the IND Second System was to be built, expect more stroads and boulevards in New York City. And finally, throughout the video, I talked about all of these great subway projects. But what is the cost to all of this? The answer is about $438.4 million, or $8 billion in today's money. In my opinion, that is a steal, given the fact that Phase 2 of the 2nd Avenue subway costs $3 billion per mile. However, given the financial crisis that New York City and the IND was in during the Great Depression, it was unlikely that the city could afford an additional $438.4 million. FDR, as part of his New Deal, gave 20% of the entire WPA budget to the city to complete the first system, a system smaller than the second system, and that still wasn't enough. The new system would also be more susceptible to decay. FDR passed away in 1945, and even before then, he told LaGuardia that he won't be funding any more subway projects. John Delaney, the Board of Transportation Director, and a charismatic negotiator that helped plan the IND Second System, stepped down in 1945. LaGuardia left office in 1946, and with it, ties between the federal government and New York City waned, and whatever ties that were left were taken up by Robert Moses, who systematically diverted funds away from the New York City subway and into its highways. In 1953, despite the creation of the New York City Transit Authority, who are much more skilled in getting things done than the Board of Transportation, New York City elected Mayor Wagner Jr., who campaigned on keeping the fare at 15 cents. That policy destroyed the subway's ability to fund basic maintenance, and given that the system was much larger, the decay would come much faster. Also, to the dismay of officials, it was unlikely that the removal of the elevateds would have prevented the decline of New York City. New York City, just like every city, was undergoing suburbanization, made possible by the new roads that Moses was building. With the decrease in population, less taxes were collected, which meant that less money was collected into fixing decades of deferred maintenance. Therefore, who knows what was the ability that the New York City subway could continue expanding after the IND Second System. It probably won't be very high. What I do know is that beginning in the 1980s, when New York City saw a revival, there will be a lot more gentrification. That is, if the general overhaul program gets adequately funded. And given how most of the politicians and officials that drained the New York City subway weren't around anymore and were replaced by politicians and officials that actually saw the New York City subway as a public service, it will be. With the subways running better, combined with cheap real estate in the once decimated areas of the city, like Williamsburg, gentrification would get a nitro boost. Williamsburg would see even more development, given the fact that the L train isn't the only train around, but rather there was the IND South 4th Street subway and other lines. The irony of the IND is that it contributed to the fiscal crisis of 1975, as the city spent lavishly on new subway projects and racked up a huge bill. But when New York City saw a revival, it was thanks to the subway. After all, the subway kept the city moving, and without it, New York City would be full of congestion. This would have made New York City a less attractive place to receive investment. Investment that helped New York City recover from its fiscal crisis. And with that, this marks the end of this video. If I missed anything that you think is pretty important, tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.